with Joe Coburn.
Is the BBC presenter story any of our business? Did Liz Truss have a point about economic growth? Whose idea were low emission zones? And Prime Minister's questions at noon. This is Politics Live. On the programme today, former Business Secretary and Conservative MP Andrea Leadsom, Labour MP Clive Lewis, Daily Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey and Guardian columnist and environmentalist George Monbiot. On today's programme.
People aspire to a higher standard of living. They want their children to have a better life than they had. But it's becoming harder and harder to deliver in this low-growth world.
She didn't last long as Prime Minister, but is Trussonomics back?
Sadiq Khan's odious, unjustified tax on driving.
Boris Johnson attacks London's ultra-low emission zone, but wasn't he mayor when it was first brought in?
With the benefit of hindsight, would you like to apologise to the taxpayer for being here?
I would apologise for my role
Don't
as
want
the
to
Chief
apologise.
Executive as Ofwat, no.
Okay.
Water bosses under fire from MPs. Is it time to nationalise the industry?
We don't care that you've been in slavery in the UK. We don't care that you've been in a living hell.
Attacks on the illegal migration bill from a former Prime Minister, but the government gets its way in the Commons. Let's start with the story that's been dominating the news headlines and continues to do so about the unnamed BBC presenter at the heart of allegations that were broken originally by The Sun. In fact, let's start with their headline. The Sun says, shock new developments. BBC star broke lockdown to meet another young stranger. This is how the story is covered on the front page of The Mirror. Second youth's claim. BBC star sent threats and abuse. And this is how the BBC is covering it. Here, look at the damage. Jeremy Vine calls on BBC presenter to name himself. My question, opening the programme to the panel, starting with you, Andrea, is has the BBC got serious questions to answer, or is this ostensibly a private matter?
I think the problem is we don't really know yet, do we? And I think the BBC certainly looks as though it failed to act quickly enough when complaints were made, as I understand it, some time ago. It now looks as though the BBC is indeed taking this very seriously, and we have to wait for that police investigation and BBC investigation to find out the rights and wrongs of the matter. But certainly on the face of it, it appears that a huge amount of harm has been done to reputations and to feelings, at the very least, by the actions in the press on creating this huge story. And so it remains to be seen whether there was any illegality or whether this just is a complete media storm.
Right, well, on that issue, media storm, it is a huge story, one way or another, however you look at it, Clive. But is it the BBC that's got serious questions to answer, or is this looking more like a private issue?
The thing is, let the inquiry and due process take place, and then we'll get some answers. But at the moment, there's lots of speculation. You've got an algorithmic frenzy taking place on social media, which is actually affecting real people's lives. People have nothing to do with this, like Jeremy Vine and others. I think for most of the public now, they'll want to hear answers, but they want to hear real answers, not speculation. And this is damaging people, damaging people's lives. For me, let due process take place. You call it a big story, but actually, some of the things we're going to be talking about today, they're the real stories that I think people want to hear about. Let due process take place. Let's find out what happened. Let the police do their inquiry. Let the BBC do theirs, and then we'll get some answers. But I don't want to speculate on that.
Has The Sun got questions to answer?
Well, look, whether you can call The Sun journalism is another question altogether. But, clearly they've broken the story. Do they have other interests behind this? Maybe. I don't know. But at the end of the day, let's get some answers, and then we can speculate or discuss what comes out from the inquiries. But at the moment, I don't want to be, being used the clip in 3 or 4 weeks' time or 3 months' time, having said something which is, comes back to haunt you. There you go.
Since the story first broke in The Sun, Camilla, it's now in the realm of claim and counter-claim. So how do you view it in terms of the serious questions that the BBC has to answer or not, or whether this is looking as if it is about a private issue, a private matter and a private life?
You say it's about claim and counter-claim. It seems to be about claim and further claims, because there are now 4 different claims, one of which has been reported by the BBC. So you ask, is this something that we should be interested in? Well, the BBC itself is reporting claims about one of its own presenters. I don't know why Clive is disparaging The Sun or any other tabloid that many Labour voters read. I mean, The Sun, it might not be personal to your choices, but there's no need to disparage journalism if, for instance, they've found out that there's been some behaviour.
I'm disparaging The Sun, responsible for Hillsborough, responsible for a number of other things.
And are responsible for a load of other stories that are perfectly within the public interest. I won't take lectures about journalism in general from somebody who seems to have a vested interest.
But on this story.
But anyway, on this story, you know, at the end of the day, as is ever the case with privacy cases in the light of the Supreme Court's judgment on Bloomberg and indeed the High Court's judgment on the BBC's treatment of Sir Cliff Richard, you're going to have to weigh up the reasonable expectation of privacy of this BBC presenter against whether it is in the public interest, and not just interesting to the public, but in the public interest to know. And The Sun in its editorial today is saying, yes, we think it's in the public interest, not just because of the individual involved, but also because of there seeming to be a dragging of the feet, let's put it mildly, of the BBC in investigating what are really quite serious claims, criminal or not. You know, there's also a moral question to be asked of some of the behaviours that are being alleged in this story.
George?
So there are 2 crucial issues here which somehow have to be balanced, and one is the presumption of innocence. You know, it could be that this story is nothing at all, and that if the person were named, an innocent person will have had their life ruined by being dragged over the coals in public. But the other one is that we know that the majority of victims of abuse, and I suspect we all know victims of abuse, tend not to come forward until other people have come forward. You know, one of the things that victims of abuse suffer more than anything else is the isolation. You know, they feel they're alone in it, and they sometimes feel symptoms of guilt and other things which they load onto themselves. And it's only when they find out that someone's been doing it to other people that then they feel empowered to come forward. And of course that can't happen until a person is named. And so we've got these 2 really important, crucial principles which seem to be directly at loggerheads here. And this is an incredibly difficult land to navigate.
Clearly.
And there's no easy answers.
All right, let's talk about the Growth Commission and see if we can navigate that. It's the latest brainchild from Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister. You'll remember her talking a lot about growth, or rather the lack of it, and how to deal with it. It's been launched today. Let's talk to one of the Commission's economists, Ewan Stewart from Walbrook Economics. What is the Commission? What are you saying about the problem with the British economy when it comes to growth?
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I mean, we've launched the Commission today. It's an international body. There are economists from the UK, America, India, Mexico. This is a global commission looking at a problem which is counterintuitive. We're living in an age of great technological change. And I think if you just take a step back, you should actually think that the economy of the West should be doing very well. We've got AI, we've got technological improvements, we've got all sorts of medical improvements which were undreamt of. But actually, growth in the G7 has been slowing down rapidly. It peaked in the 1950s and the 1960s, got a little worse in the 70s, but it's really in the last 20 years that growth has fallen off a cliff.
Why?
It's particularly the case in the UK and the European Union. Why has it fallen off a cliff? I think there's a number of today we've set the problem, and we challenge the question as to why growth should be so low at a time of such opportunity. And growth globally is not low. Growth is strong in China, in India, and elsewhere. The Commission will be addressing the very question you just answered in the fullness of time, but I think we'll be looking at a range of aspects. We'll be looking at the growth of the size of the state. We'll be looking at the role of monetary policy.
All right.
We'll be looking at regulation, for example.
All right, well, let's bring it sort of down to ground level when we're discussing these issues, because first of all, people might not know exactly what you mean when you're talking about growth in general. It's bandied about. And secondly, you do have a couple of eye-catching statistics, including the one on the difference in pay, average pay for various jobs between a UK worker and a worker in America.
OK, what does growth actually mean? It is... We're looking at per capita, that means per individual, per family, the growth in the GDP or the wealth of the individual. And it really matters. It might sound boring and arcane, but if you grow just 1% faster per annum, you will have a dramatic impact on your wealth. Each 1% in a UK case is £25 billion. A lot of money. Compact that over 10 years, and it's £200-300 billion. That pays a lot of tax and actually a lot of extra money for families. You mentioned particularly America. The gap between the average individual in America and the UK is £10,000. £10,000. Now, just imagine what £10,000 buys. But if we can grow the economy, and you'll see the charts in our presentation that shows that growth in the UK and the European Union in particular has fallen to very low levels. Yeah. For each extra 1%, that's 25 billion a year.
All right. Well, let me bring in our other guest to respond to what you've said. Let's pick up on that figure of £10,000, the difference between a UK and US worker, broadly speaking. Andrea, you've been in government. The Conservatives have been in government for 13 years. That's happened on your watch.
Yeah, I mean, productivity, the amount that each person who's working contributes to that growth has been very low, historically very low. It's really since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And actually solving that is the big challenge for the government.
You've had 13 years, Andrea, and you're not a commentator. I don't mean you particularly, but your government. You are in this. This is what you were there to deal with, and you've failed.
Absolutely. Well, what the government has done is to put rockets under... So Jeremy Hunt, for example, with his last two fiscal events, has put measures in place that will encourage business, so full expensing, so that businesses can invest in technology, in new automation and so on to get productivity up. That's what leads to growth. We've also got rocket-fired our green economy. So since 2010, 99% of all solar fields have been created in the UK. We're half the world's offshore deployed wind, and that is where the jobs and growth.
Well, hang on. Let's see what you and do you think that's going to do it?
Look, I think we are going to cost individual regulations, and we're going to build a dynamic model which will build into the policy sphere. But actually, I think we've got to take a step back, because in the last 20 years, the state has moved, and I'm speaking personally rather from the Growth Commission here, from about a third of GDP under Tony Blair to 47% of GDP today. And there's little doubt to my mind that since the lockdown, the country has lost its mojo. And it's lost its mojo to the extent that within 10 years, Poland are likely to have the same wealth per capita as the UK.
The UK's lost its mojo. I mean, that is pretty damning indictment.
And that's a personal view, I think Ewan Stewart's just said.
So he's wrong?
No. That's his view. It can't be wrong, can it? It's his view. But the fact is that during the pandemic, the government put in place one of the biggest support packages. The reason why we came out of the COVID pandemic faster than any other European country was because we had our own vaccines, our huge strength in our life sciences sector. But that package of support was enormous. And hot on the heels of it was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And as a result of that, our fiscal position is absolutely dire. We're spending, we have something like 100 billion of interest costs right now, with inflation raging. All of these things are mitigating against the success of our economy, which is exactly why Rishi Sunak's top priority on the economy is halving inflation and getting growth going again.
Which doesn't look as if it's achievable at the moment in terms of inflation, which is sticking.
That's why I was trying to give some examples, improving
productivity. Sure, and I hear them, but at the moment they're not moving the dial. I mean, listening to you and Stuart, and this is Liz Truss's, as I say, launch Growth Commission. Should we listen to them, Clive?
Well, it's a very good question. The fact that they've chosen Liz Truss to front this, someone responsible for my constituents facing, growing rocket-high mortgage rates for a collapse of the economy, for a run on the pound. We're still reeling from the effects of that. And you bring someone out like that whose economic policies cause much of the disruption, not all, but much of the disruption we're facing today, to front an economic launch. And so that makes me question who are the people, who are the forces behind this. It's pretty much the same people that have been dictating economic policy for the last 50 or 60 years in this country, which have led us to where we are
All
now.
right, well, let you,
So,
do you want to defend? Do you want to defend being involved or spearheading this, Liz Truss?
I would like to. I mean, Liz Truss, certainly it was her idea, but this is not a Liz Truss initiative. This is a global initiative. 4 of the economists, possibly 5, come from the States. We've got 2 from Japan. We've got a Mexican economist. We've got 3 from the UK. This is an international body. Our debate, understandably, on this programme has been about the UK. But in fairness, growth across the developed world has been falling. Right. What we're interested in is finding positive solutions and costing what has happened and trying to find a way to raise growth. Because if we raise growth, you can have a strong NHS and educational policy. If we don't do that and we just redistribute an ever-declining cake, the country is going to be in serious trouble.
You've got some solutions. What are Labour's?
OK, so first of all, I mean, if a group of people wanted to come together, a group of corporations and others to come together to talk about truth and integrity in British politics, and they invited Boris Johnson to talk about that, that would give me some idea of the direction of travel and the seriousness of that contribution. So I think Liz Truss, what we're talking about growth, we can question the actual issue of growth as well, because we all know that the pollution that Thames Water and other companies have put into the river increases growth in GDP growth in this country. We know that digging more oil out of the ground increases economic growth, and yet it's killing us in terms of the climate crisis. So when we talk about
increased migration, when we
talk about growth, there are things I think we need to unpick, which is that most of my constituents have had growth on and off for the last 30 or 40 years, and they have not seen many of the benefits that they should have, because who's receiving that growth? And this comes to the question of distribution. And actually, we've seen more billionaires and millionaires created, and when growth happens, they're the ones that get it.
Oh, well, you respond, and then I will come, George and Camilla, to you. Ewan, what do you say to Clive?
Well, I think it's a very selective series of statistics he's given. I mean, it is a matter of fact that taxation is the highest it has been in this country for over 70 years, and public spending has increased very markedly. But we're going to look at lots of issues. That's only part of the equation, and we have not made recommendations today. We've posed the problem, and we're going to start to look to solutions.
Right.
But we are an independent commission, that's for sure.
Ewan, one of the things... Sorry, George, one of the things Ewan said is that growth really matters. And he's explained what growth is and why it matters to individuals and to households. Do you agree?
It's absolutely crazy to use GDP as a measure of societal success. It
Why?
was never intended that way. Simon Kuznets, who came up with the concept, he himself said it should not be used in this way because there's very little connection between any particular increment of GDP and an increment of public well-being. If you look at what Liz Truss was trying to do, supposedly to boost growth, of course it all massively fell apart, what she was trying to do was to tear down our planning controls, to build investment zones in national parks.
But don't houses need to be built?
Not in this way. In fact, she also tried to tear down the obligation to build affordable housing, all in the name of boosting growth. She was ripping down public protections for the living world, protections for workers. In other words, all the things she was doing to boost GDP actually were damaging human welfare and damaging the living planet. And we see this again and again. The goals we should set as a society are human well-being and the protection of the living planet, are an increase in happiness. And to set GDP instead, and in direct contradiction to those goals, is about the stupidest thing we could possibly do. And it's notable that Liz Truss was making that speech at the Heritage Foundation in the US, which wants to tear down even more public protections and make our lives even worse. When you look at the stats worldwide and you see where the highest levels of reported happiness and well-being are, those are the places where you have a much better distribution of wealth, more investment as a proportion of wealth in public services, which is exactly the opposite to what Ewan is saying.
Heritage is associated, obviously, with Thatcher and Reagan, who are in turn associated with growth economies rather than manage decline. I mean, the other point that hasn't really been raised here is onerous business taxes. You know, there is a stifling of productivity because businesses feel that they've had another 6% shaved off already fragile profit margins after COVID. There's the 85 grand tax VAT threshold, which sometimes disincentivises people from earning more money. I mean, we've got tax systems in play. We've got the highest tax threshold since the Second World War, which are actually disincentivising people in business to grow their businesses and therefore create more jobs and create more wealth. And that's a problem. And I don't know what Labour or Clive's solution is to that. If you're talking about hammering once again millionaires and multimillionaires who, at the end of the day, do pay most of the tax in most
I think you're
countries.
sticking to the Conservative plans, aren't you? You're not doing anything different.
That's the official fiscal rules for the first 2 years, I believe. Yeah, that's correct. But that doesn't mean that between now and the general election, there could be a conversation about wealth taxes or potentially a policy on that. And I guess the key thing here is when we're talking about the highest percentage of taxes over so many years, you think about it, the share of income that that is in the economy for people to actually then spend has reduced considerably because so much wealth has now gone to the top 5%, top 1%. So actually now it is an opportunity to actually say, well, if we want to have more to spend without increasing the tax burden on most working people, we need to look beyond income and start looking at wealth. And I think that's
a lot of Labour MPs and commentators say that, but I haven't heard that discussion as yet by Labour front benchers. Maybe it is something that's going to be approached and tackled. And can I come back to you on a point that George Monbiot made, which is it is the stupidest thing to do, which is to use GDP as a measure of success?
Well, it's been consistently used by almost all major countries and across the world for very, very many years. It is the basis that the OBR, the Treasury, forecast their models for tax and economic growth. Of course, other factors are important in life, happiness, wealth, well-being, etc. But GDP is a strong indication of the tax take that a country will take. It's an indication of relative wealth and whether a country is doing well or less well. And the harsh reality is the G7 generally is starting to do, and over a fairly long period of time, underperform. And if we want our children to have the benefits that we all had, we've got to solve this problem.
George?
In 2021, 63% of all the new wealth generated in this country was taken by the top 1%. Of the richest people. So in other words, this GDP, which is meant to enrich us all, is being massively, disproportionately harvested by the very richest people. It is not a measure of general public welfare. It is, to a very large extent, a measure of the counter-distribution of wealth from the majority to the very rich.
Well, Andrea, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, inequality in the UK in income terms is low. Is the lowest it's been since, under Conservative successive governments than it was ever under Labour. And absolute poverty is lower than it was under Labour. But actually, I do agree with what George's key point, which is that GDP should not be the only measure of success of a country.
It shouldn't be the measure at all.
Well, I don't agree that it shouldn't be a measure at all, because quite clearly the wealth that a nation has results in tax take. And you're stating as a fact that the most of the wealth has gone to the smallest number, but so too is something like 50% of all taxes paid by the top 5% of earners. So we have a very progressive tax system in the UK, which does mean that the redistribution towards public services that we all rely on, the health service, the roads, the education system, these things are funded by the income to the economy. So I think it wouldn't be right to say, oh, forget GDP, it really doesn't matter. Growth is absolutely vital, but I do agree with you that it shouldn't be the only measure that we measure our success on.
And are you intensely relaxed there'll be no tax cuts on offer if the Chancellor is to be believed before the next election? Certainly not before the by-elections, when they're only next week.
So I think we have faced two black swan events. I mean, everybody knows that.
Yeah, but everyone's faced that. But that was the promise by the Conservatives to cut taxes.
And as a result of that, we have a fiscal position which is a total disaster at the moment. As I say, something like 100 billion of interest costs every year, with interest rates rising, with inflation sticky. We have huge problems. So the very idea of cutting taxes against that headwind would not be something I would advocate doing.
Right.
And so I'm totally supportive of what the Prime Minister has said about that.
All right, well, let's just... I just want to show you, if we can put it back up on the screen, which is a tweet from the Treasury, in fact, saying it's good news. It says analysis from IMF News has found that since 2010, real GDP in the UK has grown faster than in comparable European nations such as France, Germany, Italy or Spain. We're committed to continuing to grow the economy and provide economic opportunities for people across the UK. What's your response, Ewan, to that, what sounds like good news tweet?
Well, the Eurozone is a very poor comparative. Unfortunately, the continent of Europe is in structural decline. Its share of global GDP, global wealth, has been declining for a very long period of time. Britain has performed slightly better. The Treasury is right since 2010, but it's fairly small beer. Compare that with Australia, Canada and America, and the gap is very significant. But the point is there's no good reason for our growth to disappoint to the extent it has done, and we must raise our sights. And the Growth Commission is about raising our sights for the population.
Thank you very much, Ewan. Just briefly.
Just very quick, that kind of tells you that over the last 13 years, growth has been on average higher in the UK. Well, look at my constituents. I literally walk past homeless people on the street. I've got massive use of food banks, and yet growth has been going up higher than in Europe. What does that tell you about growth? It tells you that it isn't working in the way that it should do.
All right, growth and lower welfare.
We're going to stop it there, and we're going to talk about the ultra-low emission zone. Ewan Stewart, thank you very much for joining us. This is, first of all, a headline from former Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the Mail. The plight of an 82-year-old who'll have to pay £12.50 every time he wants to go to church proves it's time for Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan to can his cruel, boneheaded ULEZ tax on motorists. Well, you can tell where he's coming from. This, of course, is in his constituency of Uxbridge and South Ruislip, because the Mayor Sadiq Khan is intending and trying to extend the ultra-low emission zone. But, as we said in the headlines, Boris Johnson is bashing something that I think he may well have implemented. Let's find out. Let's speak to Lauren Tavriga from our Political Research Unit. What is the truth in this, Lauren?
Yeah, so it's true, Joe, that Boris Johnson was the person who first announced the ULEZ zone whilst he was Mayor of London. It was brought in by his successor, Sadiq Khan. But the reason that both of them can do that is because central government has legislated for local authorities to bring in low emission schemes. So it was under Tony Blair in 2000. He brought in the Transport Act. It applied to England and Wales. It came in slightly earlier in London the year before in 1999. And that meant that they could bring in things like the congestion charge in 2003. But governments since then have been modifying that legislation. They've been tightening it and making it stronger. So in 2017, the Conservative government brought in something called the Clean Air Zone Framework. And that has been updated since, though, and most recently last year. And what that basically said was it was a policy framework for how we would reduce the public's consumption of pollutants. Now, local authorities are required to follow that framework, and it does explicitly say in that framework that one of the ways in which local authorities can achieve that target is by bringing in charging zones. Now, I should also say that it also says local authorities should be consulting with their local communities and local residents on how this might impact them. But that is in government policy. And Johnson himself, when he was Prime Minister, his Department for Education brought out further legislation in 2021, the Environment Act, which further strengthened that legislation that Blair had brought in 20 years previously. So local authorities bringing in these low emission schemes are doing so because central governments have required them to through legislation.
Lauren Tavriga, thank you very much. Just listening to what Lauren has said, Andrea, if local authorities and councils are able to, in fact, almost mandated to meet targets on air pollution by introducing the sorts of charging schemes that Boris Johnson has just condemned, if they can't do an ultra-low emission zone, what should they do to meet those targets?
So this is one where you can actually face both ways. I mean, obviously, what we desperately need is for the air that people are breathing to be much cleaner. And in fact, that clean air zone, I do believe, was legislation that I put forward as DEFRA Secretary back in 2016 to 2017. And so I'm absolutely committed to cleaning up the air that people breathe. Right. However, I think what Boris is specifically alluding to, this expansion of ULEZ, is, of course, out in Uxbridge. I'm sure you've been there.
They don't want clean air in Uxbridge.
No, of course they do, obviously, Joe. Of course they do. The point is that if you go to Uxbridge, what you'll see is, unlike central London, where there's tube lines, everywhere you look, there's electric buses everywhere you look, there's cycle lanes everywhere you look. Actually, as you go further out of London, there is that balance to be struck between those people who literally cannot. I mean, the 82-year-old going to church is one issue, but even more of an issue is the delivery van or the person who is a carer, who is trying to get between different elderly people to provide care. And that £12.50 a day makes their living impossible. So this actually, the reason I say you can look both ways on this is because there is a balance to be struck.
Right.
And the balance, as things are, in that expansion is simply unfair.
All right,
to those people
no, fair enough. I think we've got it absolutely clear. Are you convinced by the argument set out there by Andrea? Facing both ways or hypocrisy?
Well, I mean, it's nice to know that Boris Johnson is taking an interest in his constituency, which must be the first time in human history.
Well, take that then.
Look, there's some very generous incentives being offered to people to upgrade their vehicles. I think it's £2,000 for a private car, £9,000 for a delivery vehicle, in order to help people get over that hump and to retire very polluting vehicles. And the truth of this matter is that the horrendous levels of pollution in places like Uxbridge and elsewhere are generally generated by a small proportion of the population, driving either particularly polluting vehicles or using wood-burning stoves, for instance. And with help, but also with legislation, we should be phasing that pollution out. Every month, we're now seeing new studies showing just how devastating to human health that pollution is. No one has a right to impose that on other people.
Miller?
I just find it counterintuitive if people are being asked to move to ever cleaner vehicles, and by 2030 we're going to have diesels and petrols banned.
That's the ambition.
Then the air is going to get cleaner anyway. So the air is getting cleaner, and yet people who are largely working people who are working shifts, people who are so-called white van men and women who can't take all of their equipment on the tube, are being penalised. I mean, I think somebody carried out a study saying that any public sector pay rise that may be given to nurses, carers and others is just going to be wiped out by ULEZ for people living in Greater London.
But that's not the case.
If cars are becoming cleaner, why do you need it?
Hang on.
Also, the air quality index. I mean, George always talks in these kind of apocalyptic terms. Have you ever been to Chiang Mai, George? Do you know what the air quality index is there?
You want it to be like that?
It's about 900. It's like literally off the scale. The air quality index in London has been coming down. It's less than 10.
It's still
vehicles are becoming cleaner. So why are you using this sort of sledgehammer to crack a nut? If you're wanting vehicles to become cleaner, and they are, I mean, I've got a diesel car. It passes ULEZ because it's a newer car that is more environmentally friendly, in inverted commas.
I find this argument quite extraordinary. Because it's really bad somewhere else, we should put up with it being bad
I'm just saying,
here.
You need to be relative with some of your these sort of doomsday predictions on air quality.
We have not met our 2010 air quality targets. And the reason is that a minority of vehicles and wood-burning stoves and a few other things like that are pushing us past that air quality level that we should be below. And the result of that is that we see higher cardiovascular illness, we see higher respiratory illness, more strokes, more heart attacks, more cancers.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest killer of people is obesity. So should we ban sugar? I mean, this is...
Well, let's do...
You can use all these examples.
Extraordinary thing.
It's not that extraordinary. What's extraordinary is you're completely overlooking that this is a policy that makes poor people poorer.
No,
and you're happy with
There's
it.
no evidence for that whatsoever.
Well,
in fact, it's
hang on, Camilla, let him answer your question.
The public sector wage rises
are going to be
wiped out by ULEZ.
It is the poorest people in society who are being hit by air pollution. That all the evidence shows that very clearly, and it's the richest people in society who have the most vehicles. Most of the highly polluting vehicles tend to be second, third or fourth vehicles owned by multi-vehicle families. That's where the problem is coming from, and it's landing primarily on the poor. You are completely wrong.
Well, Keir Starmer,
hang on. Doesn't affect the poor,
Keir Starmer's not that keen on the extension. Well, hang on. Keir Starmer's not that keen on it either. The extension of the ultra-low emission.
Well, he's now refused to say.
Well, I'll tell you what he has said actually. Since you raise it, Andrea, he said on LBC that Sadiq Khan, Labour Mayor, has no choice but to take action on ULEZ, except he has no choice but to go ahead because of the legal obligation on him, the legal obligations that we talked about at the beginning of this discussion. I think it's important to make clear that there is that legal obligation on the Mayor to take measures in relation to air pollution. He's not exactly endorsing it, is he?
No, but that's the truth of it. I mean, what he said is the truth of it. And this is the problem for Sadiq Khan. It's the same problem that the Greens in Germany are facing now, trying to bring in air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps in a compulsory way. It's hugely expensive. But this is the problem. Me and George have been sat here talking about redistribution of wealth in the economy and the fact that a small number of people have snaffled a lot of that wealth. So if you try to make people shift from polluting cars to less polluting cars, that's going to cost money. And if you don't have that money, if you don't have that wealth, and if you don't have the infrastructure in public transport, then people are going to struggle. So I've been quite clear, George has been quite clear, many have been quite clear, that you have to have that redistribution of wealth to allow people to make a just transition.
What about political leadership then? You might have to work hard to persuade the Labour leader, Keir Starmer. Earlier in the week, we had your colleague on, Jenny Chapman, in the Lords, having to answer questions about a quote from Keir Starmer saying, "I hate tree huggers." Let's have a little listen. So what did he say that led to that headline?
Because he was saying his motive isn't about hugging trees, and I think he talked about sandal wearing as well.
This story is getting out of control.
It is about making sure that our regions, like the North East where I live, which has big oil and gas sector, big chemical industries, steel-making heritage, that they have the jobs of the future in those places. It's about the economy.
Jenny, can I just ask also, was tofu mentioned at any point?
Do you know, tofu didn't come into it.
Right, well, Ed Vaizey intervening there. But, I mean, what is this? What is with Keir Starmer? He doesn't like sandal wearers, tree huggers...
I don't know what the weekend briefers had eaten.
Well, Jenny was in the meeting, she said.
Well, I spoke to someone else who was a bit closer to the meeting, who was also in the meeting, and said that didn't happen. Someone very close to the stories that are happening. So, you know, it's... But the point is, as a Labour, the Labour Party, we have promised 28 billion after the first 2 years. 28 billion, 28 billion, which is 90 billion still, that is going to come into that is going to be spent on that infrastructure in public transport and in making that transition. Now, if you look at the IPPR report that came out this week and talked about the doom loop in the British economy, because over the last 20 or so years, there's been £500 billion of underinvestment. If we put a fraction of that investment into public transport systems, into scrappage systems, give people the ability to travel without polluting, then you begin to solve the problem. That's what
George, is Labour going cold on its environmental commitments? Clive is quite right. They've sort of pushed back the promise of £28 billion a year into climate change policies and the oil and gas... I've got no idea, Andrew. Oil and gas... well, I don't... Anyway, well, that's a different discussion, but oil and gas licences, they are going to not approve anymore once they get to power, but otherwise they can go ahead for now. Do you think they're going cold?
This is the fear that, you know, it's hard to see that Starmer has got an instinct for these issues. Ed Miliband's very good. There are one or two other front benchers who appear committed. But Starmer, you know, he's never been a friend of the earth, really, as far as I can see. And I would love to be proved wrong. I would love him to come forward and make some really strong statements about the need to protect the living world. Because, I mean, this is our life support system. Without it, we have nothing. You know, forget your GDP, forget everything else. If we can't protect the living world, we have nothing.
Starmer's facing both ways.
Or is he talking about jobs and security because that's more important?
Because it's not popular with Labour voters. It's not popular with working people.
He eats tofu, and I'm sure he wears sandals.
Well, on that great revelation...
In North London, he wears sandals.
I'm sure they're very popular in North London. Very great revelation from Clive. Let's just dip into the chamber. Kemi Baden not there at the dispatch box, just sitting down. We will have Prime Minister's questions coming up in just over 5 minutes' time. It will be with the deputies, Oliver Dowden for the government and Angela Rayner for the Labour Party. That's because Rishi Sunak is at the NATO summit and can't make it for the second week in a row. Make of that what you will. Let's just talk about the water companies, because you'll remember the story with Thames Water specifically, the largest water company, pretty well going bust, it seems. They were in front of a select committee of MPs. Let's just have a listen to a clip of that.
With the benefit of hindsight, would you like to apologise to the taxpayer for being here and potentially putting them in this position where, yet again, another regulated market could potentially collapse and expose taxpayers to billions of pounds?
I think if you're asking for an apology from Ofwat, I think you should...
Asking for an apology from you, Ms Ross?
No, I won't apologise for my role
Don't
as
want
the
to
Chief
apologise.
Executive as Ofwat, no.
OK, thank you.
Should she have apologised, Andrea?
I mean, I think that the whole water situation is disgraceful. I think the regulation has clearly been beyond appallingly bad, and there's a lot of questions. No, absolutely not be nationalised, because prior to privatisation, the performance was even worse. I mean, show me an industry that did better when it was owned by the state. Why is the state so much a better owner than a private company?
Well, but has this been well managed? Has this been well managed?
No, it hasn't. No, it absolutely hasn't. This is disgraceful. I think the one silver lining is that it's not going to go into public ownership by default, i.e. they've managed to get money off their shareholders rather than off the taxpayer, which would be the ultimate slap in the face. But nevertheless, they have got to turn this around, and the regulators need a big shake-up, because what we've clearly seen is corporate incompetence. Corporate incompetence, added to which has been regulators asleep on the job. I mean, my constituency caseload is full. I mean, Anglian Water in my region. I've had a adjournment debate on the subject of their massive underperformance. You know, we have primary schools shutting because they've got no water.
Well, on that, though, I mean, you still defend the fact that it should stay privately run. Why?
But there's no competition. These are monopolies. It doesn't work. And look, since the privatisation of water, those water companies, against our public assets, have tripled the debt.
So why is Labour not calling for nationalising?
Well, I am, but they've tripled the debt that we all now that they now owe, and they've been paying out dividends, and they haven't invested. And we're looking at a climate crisis where droughts are going to be complex, where farmers can barely water their crops as it is. This isn't about ideology anymore. This is something we need for the future. So this isn't about ideology. It's about it's existential.
Right.
Well, so this has to be taken back under public control. There's no two ways about it.
It's been one of the biggest issues, I think. I mean, Andrea's right, and I'm sure Clive gets enormous amounts of correspondence and post on this issue. I mean, the figures are quite staggering. It serves 15 million households, Thames Water. It's lost its chief executive. It's facing collapse over its massive debts. It's borrowed staggering amounts of money, paying out huge dividends. A quarter of its water is leaking, and treating raw sewage.
Yeah. I mean, also, Ofwat appears to have been asleep at the wheel.
Yeah. But what about the company? I mean, is it justifiable to keep it going?
I mean, I agree with Andrea on nationalisation, because you know, the argument from the water companies is, well, we have put in more investment. The trouble is the customers don't see it. In my area, because I live like on the border of the Chilterns, pollution in rivers, I mean, people are tearing their hair out. Places where you used to be able to take your kids to paddle, you no longer can. I mean, more responsibility needs to be taken, but at the same time, you have to ask of the regulator, where were you when all of this was going on?
Yeah, I mean, they've been accused of falling asleep at the wheel. But is the answer nationalisation? I mean, Andrea says that was no better before, in fact, worse, if it could be.
I mean, they were basically given these crucial public assets for a song. It was legalised theft from the public realm. That's what we saw happening with the privatisation, and the results were exactly as many people predicted. They would walk off with the money, they would not invest, they would let everything fall apart, and that is just what's happened. £72 billion they have siphoned out of that industry in the form of dividends, all of which should have been invested in upgrading infrastructure. There is a fundamental split incentive when you have the private ownership of public utilities. One is a profit incentive to take as much money out as you can. The second is a duty to the public to plough as much money in as you can. Those two things cannot be reconciled.
Andrea?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree. In the case of Thames Water, it looks, on the face of it, absolutely appalling performance. But I do think that those industries are regulated. What was the regulator doing? What I would like to see is massive reconsideration of the powers of the regulator. I don't agree with nationalisation because, number one, our fiscal position simply would not afford. The shareholders of these companies are, in fact, us, our pensions, everybody's pensions. It's extremely difficult. So you can't simply steal the companies, as Jeremy Corbyn would have done, from their private shareholders, who are us, all of us. And at the same time, if you buy them back under public ownership, there's absolutely no guarantee they'll be better run, and a high likelihood they'll be much worse.
Very briefly. When I was on the Shadow Treasury team, we worked with private investors, pension companies, to work out a way of issuing a long-term bond with a stable yield that you would give out to people who had shares in water companies, including pension funds and so on, which would allow us to take it back under public ownership, but spread the costs out over 20, 30 years to give them a stable return, and it was perfectly workable.
Just before we go into Prime Minister's questions, your article, I should say, the Daily Telegraph, I'd rather walk over broken glass. That's not you, I think. The key women who are finally abandoning the Conservative Party. This is a women problem for the Tories.
Well, it's the suggestion, and it's not by the Tories, it's actually by the opposition, Labour and the Lib Dems, thinking that the best people to target come 2024 are middle-class women who are disaffected and annoyed with the Conservative Party after 13 years of Tory rule. We've separated them into different categories.
Yes.
Again, this was the opposition's label, so calling them things like well, in the case of the so-called middle classes, the Surrey shifters, people who've moved from London to the countryside, increasingly concerned about things like the conduct of Thames Water. The WIers, the sort of traditionalists who might have slow-clapped Tony Blair and sort of believed in a degree of Toryism but feel terribly let down by Boris Johnson because of his lack of moral standing. And I think it's true to say that actually, you know, women in general are extremely influential in their own households. Obviously, their earning power is higher. They're controlling the household budget, and so they're very aware of the economies of scale in their own households. Of course, they're going to be influential when it comes to any vote. I get that newspapers sometimes label key voters different things, but that's...
Here we go.
I have been asked to reply. Global oil prices have remained largely stable this year. This has not changed following the announcement of additional production cuts by Saudi Arabia and Russia. We expect the impact of the cuts will be mitigated by the increase in supply from other producers and a decrease in global oil demand, as we have seen previously.
Stephen Bullner.
Speaker, if we want to insulate ourselves from future price rises, then we need to invest in a greener future. The United States gets it. They've committed $370 billion on net zero energies. The EU, they get it. They're set to match that figure. And in Scotland, we get it. We have the ambition to lead the world on renewable energy. We have the energy, but we do not have the power. So why is Westminster trying to block Scotland's path to a safer, greener future?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we of course will continue to invest in renewables, but I would say to the party opposite, we should also invest in our energy independence, and that means investing in the North Sea. If we fail to invest in the North Sea, we'll be more reliant on foreign producers, and we will have higher carbon emissions as we import from elsewhere.
Craig McKinley.
Question 2, Mr. Speaker.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is in Vilnius attending the NATO summit. This summit is an opportunity to build on the work we have done over the past year, strengthening NATO and supporting Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, in addition to my meetings in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
McKinley.
Mr. Speaker, New Labour's old mantra used to be education, education, education. Its new one seems to be tax education, tax education, tax education. Does the Deputy Prime Minister share my disgust at Labour's plans to tax education and choice, which could lead to 40,000 pupils being sent into the state sector with the cost to the taxpayer. I have a number of English language schools in my constituency, and they are concerned that this will apply to them as well as tuition, out-of-hours tuition, and sports training additionally. Does the Deputy Prime Minister object to these measures as strongly as I do?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes, well, once again, we have seen from the Labour Party them putting the politics of envy above the interests of children in this country. And as my honourable friend rightly highlights, recent analysis shows this could lead to over 40,000 pupils leaving the schools they're in, placing further burdens on existing schools and costing £300 million.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know you're a keen historian, so I looked up the last time a Prime Minister missed 2 sessions in a row with other engagements, which was March 1996. And I'm very proud to be filling the boots of Lord John Prescott. But I think it's safe to say he's no Heseltine, Mr. Speaker. Why is it, John Prescott asked, that in Tory Britain, tens of thousands of families are facing repossession, negative equity and homelessness? And can he tell us, 27 years later, why I'm having to ask the same question?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, clearly the Right Honourable Lady did not listen to my previous comments. The Prime Minister is at NATO. Of course, that wouldn't be a problem if she'd had her way. Her old boss wanted to abandon Ukraine, abolish the army and withdraw from NATO, and he certainly wouldn't be going to any summit, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to house building, I will take no lectures from the party opposite on home ownership. My parents would not have been able to buy their own home if it were not for Margaret Thatcher and the reforms introduced by her government, and this government is building on those with record house building.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, I think he's taking lessons from the former Prime Minister on telling the facts. The last Labour government worked hard to dramatically reduce the number of children in temporary accommodation. Yeah. But under the Tories, the number of homeless children has risen by 75%. I'm proud of our record on tackling child poverty. Does the Right Honourable Gentleman feel ashamed of his?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I'll tell you what this government has done. We've lifted 400,000 children out of child poverty. We have introduced the national living wage, something the party opposite totally failed to do, and increased the national living wage by the largest amount ever, meaning £1,800 for working people, and cutting their taxes by doubling the personal allowance. That is the surest way to ensure we lift people out of poverty, and would never have happened with the party opposite.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, it's like the ghost of Prime Minister past is still here. And I tell the Right Honourable Gentleman that he should be careful about the stats he used, because the Children's Commissioner warned the other Prime Minister about peddling false narrative on child poverty around those figures. The truth is, rising bills and soaring mortgages and plummeting real wages are pushing more and more families to the brink. Those already struggling are being hit hardest by the Tory mortgage bombshell and rising food costs. So can he tell us how many primary school children have been pushed into poverty since his government took power?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I would say to the Right Honourable Lady, it is this party, not the party opposite, which extended free school meals to all 5-, 6- and 7-year-olds, something the party opposite failed to do, and it sits alongside many measures we are taking to help people with the cost of living. We are paying half of families' energy bills last winter. winter funded by our 75% windfall tax, freezing fuel duty, helping families with childcare, and delivering on our pledge to reduce the debt. It may come as a surprise to the Right Honourable Lady, but balancing the books means more than working out how many more millions to take from her union paymasters.
Mr. Speaker, once again, he talks about balancing the books. His party crashed the economy. And he seems to be completely oblivious to what it's like for working people in this country at the moment. New research out today shows that 400,000 more primary school-aged children are growing up in poverty since his government came to office. Why does he think that is?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I will take absolutely no lectures whatsoever from the party opposite about how we help children in the most need. It is record investment from this government in education, £2 billion more this year, £2 billion next year, which is giving those very children the best possible start in life, ensuring that we have the highest reading standards in the Western world. And I have to say to the Honourable Lady, listen, her leader says he hates tree huggers. They seem very keen on hugging that magic money tree.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, he doesn't even acknowledge it, let alone explain why child poverty is rising. What hope has he got of solving it? So let me try a simpler question for him. How many kids don't have a permanent address today compared to when Labour left office in 2010?
Deputy Prime Minister.
We can exchange all these numbers across the dispatch box. Mr. Speaker, these are the numbers that matter. There are 1.7 million fewer people in absolute poverty under this government, 400,000 fewer children, 200,000 fewer pensioners, and 1 million fewer people of working age, because the single best route out of poverty is a job and record numbers of people. 4 million more people under this government have got a job. That is the difference between this party and the party opposite, who always leave office with unemployment higher.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, what matters is what people feel every single day at the moment, who are going to work and can't afford their mortgage, can't afford their rent and can't afford their bills because of this Conservative government. There are 55,000 more children without a permanent address today compared to when they took office 13 years ago. We've gone from a Labour cabinet focused on tackling child poverty to Tory ministers who won't even admit the problem. Just like the Question Time in March 1996, they can only offer excuses and not answers. Lord John Prescott said to Lord Michael Heseltine that day, "How can the right honourable gentleman be so complacent in the face of sheer misery created by his government's policies? 27 years on, why are we asking the exact same thing?"
A little bit more if we carry on. Come on, Deputy Prime.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know there's a reshuffle coming up on the other side, but this audition for John Prescott's old job is just getting a little bit hackneyed. It is this government that has lifted 400,000 children out of poverty. The party opposite, I hear the right lady, claiming to be the party of working people, but under their policies, people can't even get to work. They support Just Stop Oil protesters blocking our roads. They support their union paymasters stopping our trains. And, of course, they support the hated ULEZ stopping cars across our capital. While Conservatives get Britain moving, Labour are standing in everyone's way.
Mr. Speaker, given the Mansion House Compact does not encourage our pension funds to invest specifically in British companies, what more can the government do to encourage greater investment in our companies, especially the climate technology startups, which are increasingly going abroad to find the funding they require to the benefit of our competitors?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I think my honourable friend raises a very important point about both start-up capital and ensuring that we get more money to high-growth companies. I would say that the Chancellor's Pension Compact is a very important step forward and will unlock £75 billion of additional investment. I'm quite confident large amounts of that will go to UK companies, and that sits alongside measures such as the Edinburgh reforms to financial services, again, which will help improve financial services in this country and unlock money for those industries.
SNP Deputy Leader Murray Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the Deputy Prime Minister dismissed warnings from these benches that mortgage rates were nearly back to where they were after the disastrous mini-budget. This week, mortgage rates have surpassed those levels. How high do they need to go until he and his government takes it seriously?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady knows, people around the world know, that the driver of higher mortgage rates is higher inflation. And higher inflation is caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the post-COVID supply chains. But what we have to do is make sure we halve inflation. It's only by getting inflation under control that we will be able to get mortgage rates down, and that requires discipline. Discipline on spending, discipline on public sector pay, and discipline on energy supply, all of which is lacking from that party.
Murray Black.
Bank of England predict that mortgage payments will rise by at least £500 for 1 million households. The Prime Minister says that people need to hold their nerve. The Chancellor said just last night that mortgage holders should just shop around. Speaking of his own party, the member for South West Devon said, if the circus doesn't stop by Christmas, it's over. Does the Deputy Prime Minister understand that people can't afford to wait until Christmas and that they need help right now?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the fundamental thing we have to do is to halve inflation. That is an approach that the IMF, quote, strongly endorses, because higher inflation drives higher mortgage rates. But that's not all we are doing. With the Mortgage Charter, signed up by 90% of mortgage providers, we are giving people help to extend their terms, to go interest only, and to reduce their monthly payments. Now, that action is supported by Martin Lewis, a real money-saving expert, unlike the big spenders on those benches.
Stevenson.
Last year, I visited Abbeyfield House in Wentzfield, and I was impressed by this model of assisted living for older people that gave them the independence of a self-contained flat, but the ability to eat and socialise together. I was deeply concerned to hear that a consultation is underway to close the Abbeyfield House in Wentzfield, and I went back to speak to older people. They unanimously want to stay there. Abbeyfield is a charity. His Majesty the King has been patron for 40 years now. It cannot meet the cost of updating the estate to meet environmental standards. Will my right honourable friends meet with me to see what support government can offer to Abbeyfield so that my residents don't have to leave the homes they love?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, I'm very happy to give my honourable friend that assurance. I would note that we have provided £7.5 billion of additional funding for social care and discharge, and specifically on energy. We have got an energy advice service to support smaller businesses, and we'll be piloting new audit and grant schemes which may also help.
Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, Emily booked an appointment with her local dentist in Chard, Somerset, for the 14th of June, only to be told by a neighbour at the end of May that the surgery had closed in April. Emily no longer has a dentist. All the remaining surgeries aren't taking on any new patients, Emily doesn't know what to do. So can the Deputy Prime Minister tell Emily and millions of people like her when can they get an appointment with a local NHS dentist?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman may have missed, but our NHS workforce plan is investing an extra £2.4 billion into training and retaining crucial NHS staff, including dentists and GPs. And actually, the number of dentists will rise by 40%. And I would say to people across that constituency that the best way they can ensure better services for their NHS is to vote for Faye Purbrick, the Conservative candidate.
Charles.
Mr. Speaker, could the Deputy Prime Minister let us know when we can expect allocations from the Levelling Up Fund round 3? And when it comes, will it be true to the Prime Minister's pledge that all parts of the country will benefit, including the South East and most particularly the very deserving town of Andover?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, as well as being an excellent minister, I know how committed my right honourable friend is to the town of Andover. We will shortly be announcing the new approach to the third round, and further details of this approach will follow shortly.
Pete Wishart.
Mr. Speaker, there's some things you encounter in political life that's certain to horrify, appall, or sicken you. But I don't think I've ever seen anything quite so grotesque as the painting over of Mickey Mouse on a children's mural, as was done by the Home Office in a detention centre in Kent. Now, no minister so far has roused the necessary compassion or concern to speak out about this. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to look into the deeper recesses of his soul and just simply condemn it?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I'll tell the honourable gentleman what real compassion looks like, and that means stopping the vile people smuggling trade across the Channel, condemning women and children to death. This government is taking action to deal with it with our Stop the Boats bill, and that party shamefully 18 times last night voted against it.
Bartholomew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. On these benches, we know, as the party of aspiration, the importance of home ownership. According to a recent estimate by Barclays Bank, it now takes an average of 8 years for the average first-time buyer to save for a deposit. And in parts of London and the South East, it can be longer than that. What is the Deputy Prime Minister and the government doing in order to improve the prospects for younger people who want to own their own homes?
Prime Minister.
Well, I know what a passionate champion of this issue my honourable friend is. It is actually the case that almost 850,000 households have been helped purchase a home since 2010. And actually in 2021, the number of people getting onto the property ladder for the first time was at a 20-year high, thanks to initiatives such as First Homes and the Help to Buy scheme. Of course, that stands in contrast to the party opposite, who oversaw the lowest level of house building since the 1920s.
Catherine Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With rising ticket prices, many of my constituents find they can get the best value fare by going to the staff ticket office at Lancaster Station. It's perhaps why so many of them have signed my petition to save staffing at Lancaster Station. So can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, is the closure of ticket offices just yet another cost of living bombshell hitting my hard-working constituents?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, it is important that the railways continue to reform after the record amount of money that we gave them during COVID. I would gently say to the honourable lady that if she's concerned about her constituents getting anywhere on the railways, she should condemn the totally unjustified strikes which close them down week after week.
Give forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 summers ago, the unprecedented climate change-driven heatwave caused irreparable damage to Chelmsford's flyover. And since then, people from all across Essex have been stuck in Chelmsford, traffic jams, wasting time, hitting our economic growth. We badly need a new junction at the Army and Navy, but the funding decision has been stuck in Whitehall. So will my right honourable friend use his powerful cross-cabinet convening powers to get Treasury and Transport to agree to the money so we can deliver a new junction, stop the traffic jams and get Chelmsford moving again.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I know how powerfully my right honourable friend makes the case for this scheme, and she has done so once again in the Chamber. The Chancellor was sitting next to me and would also have heard the case. I understand that the outline case, business case submitted by Essex County Council is being considered by ministers right now, and all relevant ministers will have heard her injunction.
Castle.
Scottish Ambulance Service statistics showed an increase in hypothermic call-outs of over 30% across Scotland last winter and a staggering 84% in the north in December. Whilst fuel calls have fallen slightly, food and other costs have risen exponentially. To end the perversity of energy-rich Scotland seeing 1/3 of Scots in fuel poverty and literally freezing, when will the government bring in a social tariff to ensure that the poor and vulnerable can get through this winter without calling out the ambulance service because they're freezing?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, as my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, set out in the autumn statement, we are exploring the best approach to consumer protection from April 2024 as part of wider retail market reforms. I would just reiterate to the honourable gentleman that this winter we paid half of energy bills in Scotland. That was thanks to the strength of our union.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I remind the Deputy Prime Minister and the House that yesterday was National Remembering Srebrenica Day? But may I particularly point out a little-known fact, that British soldiers took out about 2,000 civilians in April 1993 from Srebrenica. Those British soldiers were B Squadron, the 9th 12th Lancers, not widely known, but those 2,000 people from B Squadron were actually under my command, and they saved a huge number of lives by taking them out. And they, too, should be remembered for their very gallant actions, because it was very dangerous.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I pay tribute to my right honourable and gallant friend and to all of those who he commanded in the 1990s. We must honour the memory of those killed and pay tribute to the extraordinary courage shown by their families, by survivors and all those members of our armed forces who served so gallantly in that situation.
Limbs.
In the Welsh Affairs Committee, my honourable friend for Ceredigion asked the Chief Secretary to the Treasury about the varying comparability factors for Wales, for Crossrail, for Thameslink and for HS2. His answer began with, "You are dragging me into quite complex technical details." And then he gave no complex technical details. I'm sure that the people of Wales would be delighted to tackle any complex technical details were the Deputy Prime Minister to explain to the House why we are paying £5 billion for a white elephant in HS2, which by now comes nowhere near our country.
Prime Minister.
Well, it is thanks to the strength of our United Kingdom that record sums are going to Wales under the Barnett consequentials. Indeed, in the spring budget, we increased devolved administration funding by £630 million. That included £180 million for the Welsh Government. So we're ensuring resources are going to Wales so they can enhance their transport infrastructure.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If it wasn't so serious, it would be comical. However, in Horning on the Norfolk Broads, I have a whole area totally cut off from having a mobile signal, wait for it, until August, because of nesting seagulls taking up residency in the new telecoms mast. Gulls are protected, the nest can't be moved, but let's say a family holidaying on the Norfolk Broads gets into distress this summer, they will not be able to make an emergency call, which could be life-threatening. Would the Deputy Prime Minister please help me call on Natural England to be sensible and make sure that for public safety reasons we can get a mobile phone mast working in a prime holiday location?
Well, we all love the diversity of wildlife in this country, and particularly on the North Norfolk coast that he represents, but I think he makes a very strong point about the balance between that and ensuring people have access to modern communication facilities, and I shall certainly take it up with Natural England.
John Speller.
Day in, day out, the public and businesses are hit by endless chaos and confusion across government departments. For them, clearly, Britain isn't working. Yeah. Now, if I can paraphrase the Deputy Prime Minister earlier, we know there's a reshuffle coming up on their side. So, can he tell us, is this down to obstruction and incompetence in the civil service, or is it rather that so many of their ministers are just not up to the job?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I think you can see from the record of this government, whether it's cutting NHS waiting lists, whether it is record funding for our schools and hospitals, we have an excellent team that will continue to serve.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week we all celebrated the 75th anniversary of the NHS. You may not be aware, but it's also the 75th anniversary of Newton Aycliffe, a new town in my constituency, designed by William Beveridge. Could I ask the Prime Minister, to ask his honourable friend, the Prime Minister, to come and visit me as his constituency neighbour and celebrate these 75 years and indeed the 60 years of the community newspaper provided by the Howarth family?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I'm afraid I can't speak to the Prime Minister's diary, although I will make representations. I would be delighted to visit his constituency if he wishes me to attend instead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The day I had to phone my bank and tell them that I was having difficulty paying my mortgage was one that has lived with me for years. What I found was that because my income was so low at the time, ironically, I was not eligible to switch to interest only or get any help. I never want my constituents to feel the terror and abandonment that I felt that day. Can he understand that? Because his complete lack of empathy in his responses to the deputy leader of this group suggests not. I do welcome the temporary measures, but they are temporary. This is a mortgage crisis that's been 2 years in the making. Does the Prime Minister and himself really think they're going to fix it in 12 months?
Prime Minister.
Well, of course, it's deeply, deeply disturbing, upsetting and worrying for anyone to contemplate losing their home. That is exactly why my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has introduced the Mortgage Charter, now signed up by 90% of the mortgage market, which will provide support for people. In addition to that, I would say that after 3 months, people on universal credit can also apply for further support.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A government survey has shown that 75% of British businesses support improvements to the UK's sick pay system. And yesterday, my right honourable friend, the member for South Swindon, launched a report alongside WY Economics and the Centre for Progressive Change with ideas on how that could be done. So will my honourable friend make sure that we get a meeting with the Chancellor to see what ideas can be put ahead of the autumn budget, which will also have an economic boost of £4 billion to the UK economy?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend, as ever, has made a very strong case. The Chancellor is sitting next to me, and I'm quite sure he would be delighted to meet with him.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The forced isolation of people in care homes and hospitals from their loved ones since the beginning of the pandemic and its terrible consequences, as well as the many who died alone, has left a profound trauma. We've learnt the hard way that the care of a loved one is not an optional extra, it's a central part of dignified care. My Care Supporters Bill would guarantee this fundamental right. And while the government recognises there's a problem, its recently announced consultation relates to visiting and not a legal right to a care supporter at all times. So would the Deputy Prime Minister speak to the Prime Minister about bringing forward legislation in the next King's Speech?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman is right to highlight the need for care supporters to be able to have that kind of access, and I will take away the points that he has raised and raise them with my ministerial colleagues.
Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know the value of interparliamentary relations, and in particular the Interparliamentary Union, which was founded nearly 135 years ago in this place. And we are very honoured this week to be joined by the President of the Interparliamentary Union, Mr. Duarte Pacheco. Would my right honourable friend join his campaign to get the USA to rejoin this very important international organisation?
Well, as my right honourable friend knows, the United Kingdom was a founding member of the Interparliamentary Union, and I would very much like the United States to rejoin, and I'm very happy to help make that case.
We're a hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not a day goes by without serious sexual harassment allegations in organisations up and down the country. My private member's bill on workplace protection from harassment could go a long way to address some of these serious issues, and indeed the bill has full government support. However, it is currently stuck in the other place. But a compromise is now in sight to amend the bill so that it can pass through the House of Lords. Our rules require that any amendment made in the House of Lords need to come back to the House of Commons. Will he ensure that a small amount of government time is made available in this place between now and the end of the parliamentary session to ensure that this important bill will become law?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, as the honourable lady knows, we have supported the bill. We are working on the bill, and my right honourable friend, the Equalities Minister, is very happy to meet with the honourable lady to discuss the measures further.
That completes Deputy Prime Minister's question.
And as you just heard Sir Lindsay Hall, the Speaker, saying that's the end of this week's session of Prime Minister's Questions, but with the deputy leaders there, Oliver Dowden and Angela Rayner. There was a little bit of an end-of-term feel, although next week, I should say, is the last of Prime Minister's Questions, but Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer have been absent the last 2 weeks. Let's introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the government, Andrew Bowie, Energy Minister, Shadow Secretary of State for Wales, Joe Stevens, for the Labour Party, and the BBC's political correspondent, Leila Nathu. Welcome to all of you. Angela Rayner kicked off with analysis that the Labour Party has just released in the last, I should say, 5 minutes or so, showing that the number of young children living in poverty has soared by 40% since 2010. And 7 million children live in families that could be exposed to the Tory mortgage bombshell. That was very much, Leila, the backdrop to Angela Rayner's questions, picked up actually also by the SNP. This issue of rising mortgage payments for families, is it working?
Well, it's not going away. It's been mentioned repeatedly at Prime Minister's Questions, and it's clearly a point of maximum vulnerability for the government. You've got rising interest rates, mortgage rates surpassing the peak that we saw in the aftermath of Liz Truss's mini-budget. And, of course, Rishi Sunak brought in as a safe pair of hands to manage the economy. Also, the timescales we're talking about here, interest rates expected to remain high for at least next year, going into the general election. It's clearly something Labour really, really wants to keep going on, and actually something that is quite damaging to the government.
Let's have a look at this, underlining what you've just said, Leila. Steve Swinford, political editor of The Times. Bank of England says monthly mortgage repayments will rise by £220 on average, but by more than £500 for 1 million households as people come off cheaper fixed deals. That's probably this year. The big political problem for Sunak, he says, is that 4 million households are due to come off fixes by the end of 2026. This is a mortgage time bomb going off, isn't it, Andrew?
Look, we are obviously aware of the huge concern out there in the country for mortgage holders when they're looking at interest rates going up, which is why the Chancellor announced the Mortgage Charter just a couple of weeks ago that 90% of lenders have now signed up to. It should be recognised that arrears are actually down by about 70% compared to the high point in 2009. So they are far below what they used to be. However, as I said, fully recognise the huge concern being felt by people out there, which is why we've taken the action that we have.
Why aren't you offering direct support, though, for mortgage holders? Yes, you've got all these schemes, or you certainly talk to the banks and people offering mortgages. But actually, as one of the SNP MPs said, that is temporary. People are still going to have to pay, aren't they, at some stage?
Yeah, they are. And look, as I said, we fully recognise the huge pressure on household budgets as a result of rising interest rates and that knock-on effect in terms of mortgage rates. Hence why we've made it easier for people to change away from the mortgage that they're on at the minute. Why we're very, very pleased that 90% of lenders have signed up. We'd like to see the other 10% sign up as well. And we're taking action across the piece to manage the economy in a sensible way so that we can get to a stage where interest rates do begin to come down. But ultimately, this is about getting inflation down, which is the underlying cause of all of this, and that's where the priority and the focus of the government is right now.
What would you be doing differently, Joe, at this point? I know that you wouldn't be here, you wouldn't start from this point, but what would a Labour government be doing now, or what would you be suggesting on the front bench? You've suggested all the things that have been taken on by the Chancellor in terms of helping people pay their mortgages.
Yes, so obviously, they're nicking our ideas. I'm very pleased that they are, but what they haven't done, what the government hasn't done, is make the mortgage charter announcements mandatory, and they haven't given an explanation as to why you haven't made it mandatory.
90% sign up without making it mandatory.
What about the 10%?
Well, we're encouraging the further 10% to sign up.
It's not working, is it? Why not make it mandatory? There's been no real answer about why you haven't done that. And the underlying context is that, you heard it in Prime Minister's questions today, you've got rising inflation, you've got rising food costs, you've got people can't afford to pay their mortgages, can't afford to pay their rent, housing repossessions will go up, and wages are not going up at the same rate.
So would you be offering direct support?
Well,
would you be saying, here's a package, here's, I think the Liberal Democrats have got a fund, they said they would put together, of £3 billion to help people...
Hugely inflationary, by the way.
Fine, yes, we can come on to that. I mean, that is the issue, of course. Yeah. So would you be doing that? I mean, to be honest, the government is doing most of what you're suggesting, and 90% is a high number. So what else would you do?
Well, you're saying it should be made mandatory. So you can,
I hear that.
My casework is full of people who get ripped off by landlords and problems with banks and lenders. If you make it mandatory, there's a much more of an incentive on the lenders to make sure that they do what they should be doing.
And direct support?
But no, Rachel Reeves has said now is not the time for that. The focus we would have is on making these measures mandatory.
I mean, politically, as I said, this is a time bomb waiting to go off when you think about the millions of households that are going to come off those deals. You're going to be harmed at the ballot box on this, aren't you?
Look, I'm not going to get into speculation about what might or might not happen in an election. Our focus right now is on driving down inflation. That's why we're taking the action that we are. That's why, by the way, interest rates have gone up.
What action are you taking to bring down inflation?
Well, managing the economy, steadying the ship, which is what
the Bank of England, you say, is
we're supporting the Bank of England. We're supporting the Bank of England and what they're doing. It's why the Chancellor met with the Competition and Markets Authority and the supermarkets to see what we could do to drive down food inflation. We understand the issues that are out there, but our focus has to be on getting the economy back on a stable footing so that eventually interest rates can come down and therefore mortgage rates come down. That's what we are doing just now.
That may be the reason then that Rishi Sunak is saying, we'll show you the headline in BBC News, no decision yet on public sector pay rises. That even despite the fact that the pay review board advice, certainly in the case of teachers, recommending 6.5%, 2% more than the government recommendation. Why aren't you following the advice that we're always told government ministers do?
Well, look, the Prime Minister, the rest of government are considering the advice given by the independent
usually they just accept it.
Body at the minute, and they will come to a decision in due course. Obviously, we understand people want to see their wages increased. We also have to balance that in terms of our plan to drive down inflation. So the Prime Minister and the rest of government taking a view right now.
Right, and in terms of driving inflation, would Labour accept that 6.5% that has been laid out by the pay review body?
We are always seeing working people paying the price for the economic mismanagement of the Tories.
So you'd say yes to that, and people would have more money in their pocket, but it might lead to inflation?
We want to see what the pay review bodies say across the board.
But the teachers have published already.
The teachers have published already, but you've got to look at it in the context of public sector pay overall, and we're still waiting for the pay review bodies to announce in other areas. But why are we in this situation? We're in this situation because of the economic mismanagement of the Tory government.
Absolutely.
We've got strikes that have been going on for months and months and months.
Which you could call off. Your union paymasters holding the British working people to ransom, stopping people getting on train.
And taken no responsibility as the government for getting around the table and getting these disputes sorted
Utter nonsense.
out.
There have been meetings around the table. There have been significant offers made to a variety of unions regarding pay increases.
Offers. But why is it that always
some of them were
some disputes have been resolved. I mean, Layla.
But the figure is one thing. The other debate is actually whatever figure that is settled on, is decided on, how is that going to be paid for? So is the government saying that there's going to be no additional money to fund any additional pay increase for public sector workers?
Look, no decision has been taken on the peer review body's recommendations
But
right now.
that ballpark figure between 6 and 6.5% that we know now that the pay review bodies are recommending, what proportion of that is the government prepared to fund, and what will be taken from existing
There
budgets?
will be an announcement, obviously, on the government's decision regarding the independent peer review body's recommendations in due course.
Right. And Joe, Joe, it is a question for Labour as well. Do you want to see additional money? Would you be funding pay increases from additional money?
We're not in government.
You want to be, though.
We're not in government now. You're in government, and you can't say how you're going to pay for something that you're saying.
Viewers Watch would just say we've got no answers on this as yet. You're saying let's wait for an announcement from the Chancellor. The reports are certainly saying you'll have to fund any pay rises out of departmental cuts. And you won't commit either, and you want to be in government. What should the public make of that?
Part of the problem is around this dispute is it's not just about pay. So it's also about recruitment and retention and work levels.
Pay would help, wouldn't it?
Pay would obviously help, but if you look at the disputes in the public sector, a lot of it is to do with working conditions and recruitment and retention. We've seen it in the NHS. You've announced or nicked a workforce plan from us again, but you haven't said how you're going to pay for it. We've said how we would pay for it if we were in government.
Well, we're not getting very far in terms of getting answers. We've got 1 week, of course, for another Prime Minister's questions. I don't think you two will necessarily be here next week to answer them, but let's go on to this. Another key priority for the government that so far is a little bit stuck. BBC News, senior Tories criticise illegal migration bill, but MPs reject Lords' changes. There were a load of changes and amendments put forward by the Lords, but it did get through the Commons. What is the state of this bill now, Layla?
So it's back in the Lords today. There were 20 amendments that the Lords gave to the bill. The Commons did reject most of them. The government did make some concessions earlier in the week, specifically around time limits for the detention of children and pregnant women, also not applying this bill retrospectively, which was the intention. So when it becomes law, it was going to apply to anyone who arrived here
in March, wasn't it?
Yeah, from March. That now is not happening. Questions as to why that concession was actually made, whether it actually helps the government in terms of detention facilities. But this is going to go now down to the wire in terms of the back and forth between the Lords and the Commons. I mean, some Tory rebels are still asking for significant concessions from the government, not even happy in terms of what they've heard already. Lords have the opportunity to tinker with it again, and government very clear they want this to be passed by the end of summer, but also really worth remembering that this is one piece of the puzzle. The foundation of this bill is the Rwanda scheme, which is currently also held up in the courts. So when you describe this as stuck, it's stuck on two counts, both in terms of the bill and its foundation in terms of being able to send people back to Rwanda who arrive on small boats.
How likely is this going to be passed by the summer, Andrew, honestly?
Well, we're determined to pass this bill. I think it's essential that we
pass the bill by next Thursday?
We are determined to get it on the statute book as soon as possible so that we can
in
take
whatever
action to stop the votes.
In whatever state it's in.
We are absolutely determined to get this bill through, and I think it's shameful that we had a record number of consecutive votes in the House of Commons last night, 18 times the Labour Party trooped through the lobbies to stop our plan to stop the votes, and yet have no plan of their own. Have no plan of their own to stop the votes. If they had a credible argument and a credible alternative, I could understand that. But why are they stopping us moving forward with our plan to stop the votes, stop the people smugglers, and clamp down on this pernicious trade in human life?
I mean, even because this bill won't do that, and you know that it's a complete con.
But what's your solution?
It will not. We've published a 5-point plan on this. You have cut money from the National Crime Agency. Yeah. We would fund a cross-border unit with the National Crime Agency, with officers placed in the UK and Europe to stop the smuggler gangs. We clear the backlog. In doing that, we would end hotel use, which is costing billions of pounds and going up and up and up. We'd reform resettlement schemes. We'd have a new agreement with France.
And new agreement with France. We have an agreement with France. We signed just a few months ago.
A better agreement with France.
And
the reason why
and if the French agreed to this new agreement.
The reason why it's taken you so long is because you destroyed our international reputation.
Absolutely.
Other countries didn't trust us to stick to agreements because you put forward bills that breached international law. So, you know, this is a con, this bill. It will not do what you say.
All right, you're not going to agree.
Make the situation
You're not going to
worse.
agree on the bill, particularly on the Rwanda plan. As Leda quite rightly says, we don't have a final decision from the courts. Let me just show you this image, because it was controversial, discussed in the Commons, but it was raised again by SNP MP Pete Wishart, who said, and I paraphrase, he'd never seen anything as awful or as appalling as this image of Mickey and Minnie Mouse in an asylum centre. It was painted over. It was painted over. It was supposed to be there for young people and children, obviously people trying to claim asylum. It was painted over. Do you agree with Pete Wishart? That was an appalling thing to do.
Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, explained the reasons for the decision yesterday at the dispatch box. He decided that it was not age appropriate for the part of the detention centre that it was in, and so the decision was taken to paint over it.
Leila?
Well, I mean, that is the argument. Clearly, it seems like quite a sort of, I don't know, petty example of Robert Jenrick's deterrent approach to some. I mean, would you accept that whether it's appealing to teenagers or not, it's actually you know, quite a petty way of making that point?
Look, I take at face value the reasons that Robert gave yesterday at the dispatch box. It wasn't age appropriate.
Well, it's clearly touched a nerve, hasn't it? I mean, so many people are raising it.
It's obviously touched a nerve, of course it has, and I can understand why people are concerned about it. But
it looks heartless, doesn't it?
The decision was taken for the reasons that Robert set out, and I think what we really should be doing is focusing on getting this bill across the line and dealing with the asylum backlog.
Getting involved in micromanaging the decoration of children's detention centres. He's supposed to be a minister.
Robert Jenrick is the Immigration Minister, and he's doing what he can to...
Why is he micromanaging decoration?
Well, maybe if you supported Robert Jenrick on the immigration bill, and we could actually focus on the real
Joe, actually, before we move on, there isn't an alternative. There isn't an alternative, is there, from Labour in terms of dealing with or trying to stop, as you call it, this illegal trade of people smuggling? You've put out this 5-point plan. It's long-term. It does rely on some of the things the government's already doing. Even Ken Clarke, who, as he said, is not exactly hard-line on immigration, said, actually, maybe we should try Rwanda because there is no other alternative.
Rwanda is too expensive, ridiculously expensive. It's unworkable, it's unethical, and, you know, and it's in the courts for a reason, because there are concerns. Because it probably breaches international law.
That's not what the judges found. That's not what the judges found last week. In fact, he said that Rwanda is a safe country.
It hasn't got to the end of its journey in the courts yet.
It hasn't got.
Wait and see.
It hasn't been rejected.
No, but wait and see what happens at the end. But the fact is, the bill is not going to solve the problem. The bill is going to make it worse, and it will also. And you had two former leaders of the Tory party. Two former leaders of the Tory party saying that this is essentially a green light to modern slavery and traffickers.
They don't say that about the Rwanda plan. Ian Duncan Smith and Theresa May have issues about certain elements of the bill.
They said it about the bill.
But they back the Rwanda plan, which is something Labour simply will not do.
Well, Andrew, can I just read to you what Theresa May did say, the former Prime Minister? I know that ministers have said this bill will enable more perpetrators to be stopped, but on modern slavery, I genuinely believe it will do the opposite. It will enable more slave drivers to operate and make money out of human misery. What do you say to her?
Well, I fundamentally disagree. This bill will stop the votes, will combat the pernicious trade in human life, and will enable the asylum seeker to get on and deal with the genuine asylum cases for people who are seeking to start a life here in the United Kingdom.
Let's have a look at this headline in The Independent. Leila, Boris Johnson fails to hand over mobile with crucial COVID WhatsApps before inquiry deadline. Tell us what this is about.
So this goes back to the official COVID inquiry demanding all government communications relating to the handling of the COVID pandemic. Asked the government to provide unredacted copies of all messages and notebooks relating to Boris Johnson's communication with various other people. Now, the government said, yes, we'll give you what we think is relevant, but you cannot have everything, because they argued that some of it was unambiguously irrelevant. It went to court. The government took its own inquiry to court. In event, it's been ruled against. So they had a deadline for Monday at 4 o'clock to hand over all this unredacted messages. Boris Johnson has been clear that he wants to hand them over. So it's looking as if the government is somehow obstructing this. They've lost their legal challenge, but they've also missed this deadline now. So it looks like there's going to have to be some further communication between the government, the Cabinet Office and the inquiry to explain. And the delay seems to be coming down to some difficulty accessing messages from Boris Johnson's old mobile phone, security issues around old messages because he had to change phones in the middle of the pandemic. So it's coming down to that. It looks like the government and Boris Johnson's team are sort of trying to work around this together, but it certainly doesn't look good that the government is still in a position of not actually handing over all the required material.
I mean, is the government fully cooperating here with the inquiry?
It is fully cooperating. As far as I'm aware, the reasons for this are the reasons that you've just set out. There are issues accessing old messages from the former Prime Minister's old phone, security issues as a result of him having to change that. And I do believe that that is what has prevented these messages from being handed over. Boris has been quite clear. He wants to hand over the messages to the government. Yes, of course.
You tried very hard not to.
We did, but the court found against us, and we are fully cooperating with the inquiry. I genuinely believe it is the security reasons that and the difficulties around the old messages that are holding things up.
I mean, those are legitimate reasons, aren't they, when they come to security, particularly in government. If you were in government, you'd want the same sort of caution around material that is being handed over.
The government set up this inquiry. They knew that as part of that, you should be handing over everything to the inquiry. Months have gone by. We're in this situation because the government made a legal challenge against the inquiry chair, whom they appointed themselves. And I'm afraid it just reflects really badly on the government. It does reflect badly on the government, and the public look at the government and think, can we trust them? Look at what they did during the pandemic. Now look at what they're doing. And it's just got what have we got to hide?
Let Andrew respond. There's a legitimate argument or debate to be had about what is relevant and what information should be passed and possibly then make its way into the public domain. However,
hang on, Joe. Let Andrew
that argument was had, that discussion was, that debate was had. The courts found against the government in this case, and we are fully cooperating. In this specific instance, it is about security, which is incredibly serious, and I doubt very much.
Johnson left his mobile phone number on the internet. That's why he had to change his phone.
I doubt very much that a Labour government would be taking any different action to the one that we are.
I think we probably would.
Well, hopefully we won't have to find out.
Right. I mean, do you think that is the case? I mean, the COVID inquiry is obviously critically important for all the reasons that we know, that lessons need to be learned, and also the families need to get some of the answers about how decisions were made. Do you think at the very least, Andrew, it looks as if, even though you've responded, you say, positively, even though you lost that case, does it look as if the government is trying to drag its feet a bit over this, that it doesn't want full transparency, or at least it's not comfortable with that idea, and that will make people question the motivation?
No, I don't think it does. As I said, a legitimate debate had to be had about what was relevant and what wasn't. The courts have ruled against the government. We are now fully cooperating. By the way, if there's anybody dragging their feet regarding an inquiry, it's the Labour government in Wales who are refusing to even have an inquiry into the situation
has given
in Wales.
To the inquiry.
Scotland are having an inquiry. The UK are having an overall inquiry. Why won't Labour agree to have an inquiry in Wales?
Because Mark Drakeford has given evidence to the inquiry.
The former First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has given evidence to the UK inquiry, and Scotland is having its own inquiry.
Why
can't Wales? Why is Labour running scared of an inquiry?
Labour's not running scared of an inquiry because Labour's not running scared of an inquiry because there is dedicated space within the inquiry that Heather Hallett is chairing, which will be for Welsh Government. And that's why Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, and the former Health Minister, Vaughan Gething, gave evidence in the first tranche, the first theme of it, last week.
We all remember during COVID how clear it became to the people of this country just how disparate the provision of health services are in the United Kingdom and the devolved nature of so many of the decisions. So surely there is a role for the Welsh Government to set up an inquiry to look at the decisions that were taken in Cardiff regarding the people of Wales, just as the Scottish Government has accepted there is one in Edinburgh.
That is happening in the UK inquiry. And if you read the terms of reference of it, you'd know that.
Yeah, but I have read the terms of reference of it, and I accept that there is space for an investigation into what happened in Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland within the UK inquiry. But if Labour was so keen on transparency and so keen to get to the bottom of the decisions that were taken over COVID, they should have their own inquiry in Wales.
All right, let's leave it there because I want to just touch on the issue of vaping. We have discussed it a few times, Layla, on Politics Live, and a lot of parents very worried about the impact, pernicious impact on young people particularly. The Labour Party are actually having an Opposition Day debate. Explain what that actually means.
Well, Labour gets a certain amount of parliamentary time to bring attention to issues it cares about. Today they're using a debate to talk about tackling marketing of vaping to children and young people. Clearly, it's something rising up the political agenda. You know, the Prime Minister's actually talked about this relatively recently as well, saying that, you know, it's unacceptable that vapes are being sold to children. The feeling is that they're actually a stop smoking tool for adults and there shouldn't be a sort of product aimed at children. I'm not sure there's much difference between the two parties, but clearly something both actually very keen to talk about.
Yeah, well, I mean, it will be of interest, definitely, to people out there. Should it just be banned, the marketing? I mean, it is unbelievably pernicious in terms of how it is displayed to young people, young girls particularly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, the government are deeply concerned about this. In fact, just recently we've closed quite a few loopholes regarding the ability of vaping companies to market and, in some cases, even sell nicotine-free vapes to children. And a call for evidence has, in fact, just closed on this. So the government, I'm sure, will be taking action in response to that call for evidence very soon. So it is something we're concerned about and take seriously.
Right, and should there be more regulation then?
Well, as I said, the call for evidence has just closed.
But what do you think? Should it be more regulated?
Well, I mean, I think we need to see what the call for evidence, the responses.
Well, actually, there were measures.
There
were measures in the Health and Care Act 2022 on this to deal with the vape packaging and branding to appeal to children, and the Tories voted against it. So they had a chance in 2022 to do that.
Look,
we haven't had the tobacco control plan either, which we're still waiting for. That was promised by the end of 2021. It still hasn't arrived. So we would like to see branded vapes that are advertised to children banned. We'd like to see the government take action on that. And we want to see more work with local councils and with the NHS to help ensure that e-cigarettes are being used as an aid to stop smoking rather than a new form of smoking.
No, well, that is, of course, that was the idea, and there was plenty of evidence to say that it was better if you were already a smoker. It's people that are starting on vapes. What about taking on these, some of the things that Labour is suggesting beyond banning the marketing to children?
Look, the government will look at any and all action necessary to stop this trade. I think we look forward to this afternoon's debate with interest.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me for this part of Politics Live. I will be back tomorrow for another programme. It is still on at the earlier time of 11:45 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. But next week, of course, we'll be back to our normal time of 12:15. From all of us, bye-bye.
Peter Anthony Scott Farker, can we be betrothed?
Ben lived with him and